Okay, let's talk about one of the most famous experiments in the history of science. It's a story about a race against light, a hunt for an invisible cosmic ocean, and what is, quite possibly, the most brilliant failure of all time. Now, this is the story you probably heard in school. It's the legend that gets printed in so many textbooks, right? It's clean, it's simple, one experiment happens, and boom, it leads directly to a world-changing theory. It's a great story, but it's not quite true.
Because like a lot of great stories, the reality is so much messier, way more human, and honestly a lot more interesting. The real story is full of doubt and frustration and a deep mystery that actually haunted its creators for pretty much their entire lives.
To really get why this experiment was such a big deal, we have to go back in time. We're talking about the 19th century, a time when physicists were absolutely convinced that the entire universe was filled with this invisible substance. And this wasn't some wacky idea. It was the bedrock of how they understood light itself.
The thinking went something like this. Every wave we know of needs something to wave through. Sound waves need air. Ocean waves need water. So light waves, traveling all the way from the sun through the vacuum of space, they must be traveling through something too. And they called that something the luminiferous ether. This was not a fringe theory. This was mainstream accepted science.
But here's the thing. This ether had to be some really weird stuff. To make all the observations fit, it had to have this bizarre, almost contradictory set of properties. It had to be a perfect fluid so that planets could just glide through it without slowing down. But at the same time, it had to be incredibly rigid, stiffer than steel, actually, to support the ridiculously fast speed of light.
So physicists were sure this ether had to be there. They just needed to finally prove it. And that's where our heroes, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley, step onto the stage. They came up with this experiment that was so incredibly precise, so clever, that it was supposed to once and for all detect our planet's motion through this invisible cosmic ocean.
The basic idea is pretty simple. Imagine you're in a convertible, speeding down the highway, and you stick your hand out the window. You can feel the wind pushing against it, right? Well, the thinking was, as the Earth hurtles through space, it should be creating a similar effect, an ether wind. All Michelson and Morley had to do was build a machine sensitive enough to measure it.
And this is the genius of their device, the interferometer. What it does is it takes a single beam of light and splits it in two. It sends those two new beams off on different paths at right angles to each other before bringing them back together. Now, if this ether wind was real, one of those beams should have a tougher journey than the other, meaning they should arrive back at slightly different times. It's basically a race.
So here's the kicker. According to all the physics they knew, it absolutely should not have been a tie. The beam that was traveling across the ether wind should have had a little advantage and gotten back first. But that's not what happened. The reality was, well, it was shocking. Every single time they ran the experiment, the two beams of light arrived at the exact same moment. A perfect tie. This result wasn't just a little surprising, it was impossible. It completely flew in the face of everything they thought they knew about how light worked, how motion worked, really the very fabric of the universe itself.
They got nothing. A null result. No change, no delay, no wind. And believe me, they checked everything. Their setup was so incredibly sensitive that it was built on this huge block of sandstone floating in a pool of mercury, just to dampen any vibrations. They ran the experiment day and night, in the summer, in the winter, as the Earth moved around the sun. And the result was always the same. Nothing.
In this quote, I think, just perfectly shows the human side of this whole story. See, for us, looking back, this is a huge, triumphant moment in science. But for Albert Michelson, it was a colossal failure. He designed the perfect machine to measure the ether, and it found nothing. He went to his grave basically believing his experiment just hadn't worked.
The irony here is just incredible, isn't it? In 1907, Michelson wins the Nobel Prize for the very experiment he considered his greatest failure. But even decades later, he was still haunted by it, convinced that there was a solution out there that he just hadn't found yet. So, if the experiment was seen as a failure by its own creator, how on earth did it end up changing the world? Well, this is where we get back to that whole legend about Albert Einstein. And this is really the key takeaway. The experiment didn't give physicists an answer. It gave them a crisis. It was like it took a sledgehammer to the foundations of classical physics. It proved that their understanding of the universe had a massive fundamental flaw. It created this huge intellectual vacuum that only a truly revolutionary idea could fill.
So let's just break down that folklore we started with.
Did the experiment disprove the ether? Not really. It just showed it was undetectable. Did it force Einstein to invent relativity? Well, here's the craziest part. Einstein later said he wasn't even aware of the experiment's results when he came up with special relativity. The real story is just so much messier and way more fascinating than that simple legend.
So what was the experiment's true legacy? Its real importance was in the questions it forced people to ask. It challenged an assumption that had stood for centuries, and it forced physicists to consider a really radical question. What if? What if the speed of light is always the same, no matter how fast you're moving?
And that question is what led to Einstein's brilliant solution. He basically started over. He built his theory of relativity on two simple postulates. And the second one, the crucial one for our story, was that the speed of light in a vacuum is a universal constant. He just made it a fundamental law of the universe, which is exactly what the Michelson-Morley experiment had accidentally and shockingly demonstrated all those years before.
So it kind of leaves us with this thought, doesn't it? The story of science, the way it's often taught, gets cleaned up. It's turned into this neat, logical march of progress. But the reality is a human story, full of confusion and dead ends, and yeah, brilliant failures. It really makes you wonder, what other facts that we learn are just the simplified, cleaned-up story?